Dinah Bell stood at the kitchen window on a December night in 1837, her breath fogging the frozen glass as she stared into the swirling snow beyond. By dawn, that same window would stand wide open, frost coating the wooden floor in crystalline patterns that shouldn't have survived the warmth of the cook fire. Dinah would be gone, vanished into the winter darkness like smoke, and the only trace of her departure would be a single handprint pressed into the icy window pane, a mark that would refuse to melt even when spring came and the magnolias bloomed again. The plantation owners would search for weeks. The patrollers would comb every creek and hollow for miles. But Dinah Bell had done something no one thought possible. She had disappeared on the coldest night of the year and left behind only questions and that impossible frozen handprint that seemed to watch over the kitchen like a guardian spirit. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Caldwell plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of Mississippi Delta bottomland, rich soil that produced cotton by the ton, and wealth that built mansions with columns like temples. Marcus Caldwell owned 214 souls, as he liked to say when he tallied his property in the leather-bound ledger he kept locked in his study. Dinah Bell was number 143 in that ledger, purchased at auction in Natchez when she was just 16 years old, brought north to work in the big house kitchen under the supervision of old Hattie, who had been cooking for the Caldwell family since Marcus's father had built the first cabin on this land 40 years prior. The day Dinah had been sold at auction remained burned into her memory with the clarity of something that had happened yesterday rather than 11 years ago. She had stood on the platform in the blazing Natchez sun, her wrists bound with rough rope that cut into her skin, her body on display for the crowd of white men who circled like vultures examining merchandise. The auctioneer had made her turn in a circle, had forced her mouth open to show her teeth as if she were a horse, had announced her age and her skills and her health in a voice that carried across the crowd. She remembered the feeling of being reduced to nothing more than flesh and bone, of being stripped of every shred of dignity and humanity, of standing there knowing that her life was about to be sold to the highest bidder and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Marcus Caldwell had been one of a dozen men bidding that day, standing in the shade of a live oak tree with his overseer, examining the enslaved people being sold with the cold calculation of a man purchasing livestock. He had bid $750 for Dinah, beating out a plantation owner from Louisiana who had wanted her for field work. The auctioneer had brought down his hammer with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, and just like that, Dinah's fate had been sealed. She had been taken down from the platform, her bound hands released only to be immediately shackled again with iron cuffs that connected her to 3 other newly purchased slaves, all of them destined for Caldwell Plantation. The journey from Natchez to the plantation had taken 5 days, walking in chains behind the wagon that carried Marcus Caldwell and his overseer, sleeping at night in whatever barn or shed their owner could find, eating scraps of food thrown to them like dogs. Dinah had walked those miles in a state of numb shock, her mind still back in Virginia where she had been born, where her mother and brothers still lived on the plantation that was being broken up and sold piece by piece to pay the debts of an owner who had gambled away his fortune. She had not been allowed to say goodbye to her family, had been taken from the fields one afternoon and put in chains, had been sold away before she even understood what was happening. Her mother's face haunted her still, the look of devastation when the slave traders had come, when Dinah had been separated from her family and loaded into a wagon with other slaves being taken to market. Her mother had tried to run after the wagon, had been beaten back by the overseer, had screamed Dinah's name until her voice went hoarse. Dinah could still hear those screams sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, could still see her mother's hands reaching out, could still feel the terrible helplessness of being carried away from everything she had ever known. When she had arrived at Caldwell Plantation, she had been taken to the big house and presented to Evangeline Caldwell, who had examined her with the critical eye of a woman inspecting a new piece of furniture. Evangeline had decided that Dinah was too refined for field work, had noticed her lighter skin and her careful way of speaking, and had declared that she would be trained for house service. Old Hattie had been assigned to teach her the ways of the kitchen, and Dinah had spent her first months at the plantation learning to cook the elaborate meals that the Caldwell family expected, learning to move silently through the house, learning to make herself invisible while still being constantly available to serve. Hattie had been her salvation in those early days, a woman of 60 years who had survived everything the plantation system could throw at her and had somehow maintained her humanity through it all. Hattie had taught Dinah more than just cooking. She had taught her how to survive, how to read the moods of the white family, how to avoid the worst punishments, how to keep a part of herself hidden and safe no matter what was done to her body. Hattie had been born on Caldwell Plantation, had been enslaved her entire life, had buried 3 children and 2 husbands, and yet she had never lost the fierce spark of dignity that made her more than just a slave in Dinah's eyes. It was Hattie who had first planted the seed of escape in Dinah's mind, though she had done it so subtly that Dinah had not even realized it was happening. Hattie would tell stories while they worked, stories that seemed innocent on the surface, but carried hidden meanings for those who knew how to listen. She told stories about slaves who had run away and never been caught, about the North Star that pointed the way to freedom, about kind white people who helped runaways despite the laws against it. She never said directly that Dinah should run, never gave specific instructions, but the message was clear. Freedom was possible for those brave enough or desperate enough to seek it. Dinah had listened to those stories and had begun to dream, had begun to imagine a life beyond the plantation, beyond slavery, beyond the daily degradation of being owned by another person. But dreaming and doing were 2 different things, and for the first few years at Caldwell Plantation, Dinah had been too afraid to act on those dreams. She had seen what happened to slaves who tried to escape and were caught, had seen them whipped until the flesh hung in strips from their backs, had seen them sold away to the deep South where conditions were even worse, had seen one man hanged from an oak tree as a warning to the others. The price of failure was too high, and so she had waited, had watched, had learned, had prepared herself for a day that might never come. Dinah had been at Caldwell Plantation for 11 years by that winter of 1837, and in those 11 years she had learned to make herself nearly invisible. She moved through the kitchen and the halls of the big house like a shadow, speaking only when spoken to, keeping her eyes down, her hands busy, her thoughts locked away behind a mask of compliant silence. The other enslaved people on the plantation knew her as quiet, dependable, skilled with her hands, whether she was kneading bread or mending a torn dress. They knew she had been born somewhere in Virginia, that she had been sold away from her mother and 2 brothers when the plantation where she was born had failed, that she could read despite the laws against it because her mother had taught her in secret using a Bible stolen from the overseer's quarters. The ability to read had been Dinah's most carefully guarded secret, more dangerous than any knife or poison because literacy was power and power was forbidden to the enslaved. Her mother had risked everything to teach her, had stolen an hour here and there when the overseer was away, had used a stolen Bible and a stick to scratch letters in the dirt, had made Dinah memorize whole passages so that no evidence of their lessons would remain. By the time Dinah was sold away, she could read almost anything put in front of her, could write in a careful hand, could do arithmetic well enough to keep accounts. These skills had been useless to her at first, dangerous knowledge that had to be hidden lest she be punished for having it. But over the years at Caldwell Plantation, they had become the foundation of her escape plan. She had learned early on that Marcus Caldwell was careless with his papers, leaving documents on his desk, discarding correspondence in the waste paper basket, never imagining that the slave girl who dusted his study could read every word. Dinah had read his letters to other plantation owners, had learned about the network of patrollers who hunted runaways, had discovered the rewards offered for captured slaves and the punishments inflicted on those who helped them escape. But she had also read letters from Northern abolitionists, had glimpsed newspaper articles about the Underground Railroad, had pieced together a map of the route north from fragments of information gleaned from a dozen different sources. The turning point had come 3 years before her escape, on a spring morning when Dinah had been cleaning the parlor and had overheard a conversation between Marcus Caldwell and a visiting plantation owner from Georgia. The man had been complaining about the difficulty of keeping slaves from running away, had mentioned that his own plantation had lost 15 people in the past year to the Underground Railroad. Marcus had laughed and said that he had no such problems, that his slaves were well treated and content, that he had never lost a single one to escape. The casual arrogance in his voice, the assumption that the people he enslaved were too docile or too stupid to seek freedom, had ignited something in Dinah that had been smoldering for years. That night, lying on her pallet in the cabin she shared with the other women, Dinah had made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She would run. She would plan carefully and patiently. She would gather every scrap of information and every resource she could, and when the time was right, she would escape or die trying. The prospect of death did not frighten her as much as the prospect of living the rest of her life as someone's property, of growing old in bondage, of dying without ever having been free. From that night forward, every action Dinah took was calculated to support her eventual escape. She began to hoard small items that would be useful on the journey north. A needle and thread stolen from Evangeline's sewing basket. Matches taken from the kitchen one at a time. Scraps of fabric that she sewed into a hidden pocket in her dress. She listened more carefully to the whispered conversations in the slave quarters, picking up coded messages about safe houses and sympathetic conductors on the Underground Railroad. She watched the patterns of the patrollers, noting when they rode past the plantation and which routes they took, learning their schedules and habits. She also cultivated relationships with people who might be able to help her, though she was careful never to reveal her true intentions. There was Benjamin, an older man who worked in the stables and who had a son who had successfully escaped to Ohio 5 years earlier. Benjamin never spoke directly about his son's escape, but sometimes he would tell stories about the North Star and the roads that led to freedom, and Dinah listened and remembered. There was Clara, a young woman who worked in the fields and who had family on a neighboring plantation. Family who passed along information from the network of people who helped runaways. Clara would sometimes mention in passing that the conductors were active in the area, that safe houses were available for those who knew where to look, and Dinah filed away every detail. Most importantly, there was Ruth, a free black woman who lived in the nearby town and who sold vegetables to the plantation kitchen. Ruth would come once a week with her cart, and while she was there, she would talk to Hattie about news from the wider world, about political developments and social changes, about the growing abolitionist movement in the North. Dinah would listen while she worked, and sometimes Ruth would glance at her with eyes that seemed to see more than they should, would make comments that seemed innocent but carried hidden meanings. Once Ruth had mentioned that she knew people who could help a person get to Memphis if they needed to travel. Had said it while looking directly at Dinah, and Dinah had understood that an offer was being made, a lifeline extended if she ever needed it. The months had turned into years, and Dinah had continued to prepare, continued to gather information and resources, continued to wait for the right moment. She knew that timing would be everything, that she needed to choose a moment when her absence would not be immediately noticed, when weather conditions would favor her escape, when the network of helpers was active and ready to receive her. She had learned patience through years of bondage, had learned to control her emotions, to hide her thoughts, to present a face to the world that revealed nothing of what was happening inside her mind. During those years, Dinah had also witnessed the casual cruelty that was the foundation of the plantation system, had seen things that reinforced her determination to escape no matter the cost. She had seen a young mother sold away from her infant child because Marcus Caldwell needed cash to pay a gambling debt. She had seen a man whipped unconscious for the crime of learning to read. She had seen Evangeline Caldwell slap a house slave across the face for serving tea that was too hot, then apologize to her guests for the disruption as if the slave were not even human enough to deserve consideration. She had also seen small acts of resistance that gave her hope, that reminded her that the spirit of the enslaved could not be completely broken no matter what was done to their bodies. She had seen field slaves deliberately working slowly to sabotage production. She had seen tools broken mysteriously, crops damaged by accident, animals set loose from their pens. She had seen enslaved people singing songs with coded messages about freedom, teaching their children to read in secret, maintaining their dignity and humanity in the face of a system designed to destroy both. These acts of resistance, small and large, had sustained Dinah through the years of waiting, had reminded her that she was not alone in her desire for freedom, that all around her were people who refused to accept bondage as their permanent condition. The final piece of her plan had fallen into place 6 months before her escape, when she had overheard a conversation between two of the field slaves about a route north that had recently opened up, a new series of safe houses that stretched from Mississippi to Ohio. The route was dangerous, the journey could take weeks or even months, but it was possible. People were using it successfully, they were reaching freedom. Dinah had listened to every detail, had memorized the landmarks and the code words, had drawn a mental map of the route that she later transferred to paper in a moment of privacy. Hiding the map in the secret pocket she had sewn into her dress. What they did not know, what no one knew except Dinah herself, was that she had been planning her escape for 3 years. That she had been gathering supplies and information with the patience of someone who understood that freedom was worth any weight, any risk, any sacrifice. She had stolen a needle and thread and had sewn a secret pocket into the lining of her winter dress where she kept the things she would need when the time came. A small knife taken from the kitchen when Hattie's back was turned. 6 matches wrapped in waxed paper. A handful of dried corn and 2 strips of salt pork that would not spoil. A scrap of paper on which she had carefully drawn a map copied from the one she had glimpsed in Marcus Caldwell's study when she was dusting his desk. A map that showed the roads north toward Tennessee and the places where the rivers could be crossed. She had chosen winter for her escape because everyone assumed that winter was the worst time to run, that the cold would kill her faster than any patroller's dog or overseer's bullet. But Dinah had been listening to the whispers that traveled through the slave quarters, the coded messages passed from plantation to plantation by the few who dared to help those seeking freedom. She knew about the safe houses, the sympathetic Quakers and freed blacks who would hide a runaway and send them on to the next station. She knew that the patrollers were less vigilant in winter, that they preferred to stay by their fires rather than ride through freezing rain and snow. She knew that her best chance, her only chance, lay in doing what everyone thought was impossible. The day before her escape, Dinah worked in the kitchen as she always did, rising before dawn to stoke the fires and begin preparing breakfast for the Caldwell family and the overseer who lived in the small house near the slave quarters. Hattie was sick that week with a cough that rattled in her chest like stones in a jar, so Dinah worked alone, frying ham and eggs, making biscuits, brewing coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. She carried the breakfast trays up to the dining room where Marcus Caldwell sat with his wife Evangeline and their 3 children, setting the plates before them with practiced efficiency, invisible to their eyes even as she stood right beside them. Marcus Caldwell was 42 years old that winter, a tall man with thinning hair and the soft hands of someone who had never done physical labor in his life. He wore expensive suits ordered from New Orleans and carried himself with the easy arrogance of inherited wealth. His wife, Evangeline, was younger by 15 years, a delicate woman who spent most of her days in her bedroom claiming headaches and nervous complaints that required frequent doses of laudanum. Their children ranged in age from 12 to 6, and Dinah had watched them grow from infancy, had nursed them through fevers and nightmares, had received not one word of thanks for any of it. As Dinah cleared the breakfast dishes, she heard Marcus discussing business with his oldest son, a boy named Jefferson who was already learning to manage the plantation accounts. They were talking about the upcoming auction in Jackson where Marcus planned to purchase 20 more slaves to clear a new section of land he had acquired along the river. Dinah kept her face blank as she listened, but inside her heart was pounding. She knew what those auctions meant, had lived through one herself, had seen families torn apart, children sold away from mothers, husbands separated from wives. The casual cruelty of it, the way Marcus discussed human beings as if they were livestock or furniture, made her hands shake as she stacked the plates on her tray. She returned to the kitchen and washed the dishes in water so hot it burned her hands red, scrubbing each plate until it gleamed. Through the window above the wash basin, she could see the sky darkening, clouds moving in from the west heavy with the promise of snow. She had been watching the weather for weeks, waiting for this, a winter storm that would cover her tracks and keep the patrollers indoors. According to the almanac she had glimpsed in the parlor, the moon would be dark tonight, no light to give her away as she moved through the fields. The afternoon passed in a blur of work. Dinah prepared dinner, roasted chicken with potatoes and greens, apple pie sweetened with molasses. She served the meal in silence, pouring wine for Marcus and Evangeline, cutting up food for the youngest child who was too small to manage a knife and fork. She kept her movements calm and unhurried, even though every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run now, to flee before she lost her courage, before someone noticed the tension in her shoulders or the rapid pulse beating in her throat. After dinner was cleared and the kitchen cleaned, Dinah was dismissed for the night. She walked across the frozen yard to the cabin she shared with 3 other women who worked in the fields. Nodding to the men gathered around a small fire outside the quarters, their faces lit orange in the darkness. Inside the cabin, she lay down on her pallet fully dressed, pretending to sleep while the other women talked in low voices about the day's work, about children and sickness and the 1,000 small griefs of enslaved life. She waited until she heard their breathing slow and deepen into sleep, waited until the last of the fires in the quarters had burned down to embers, waited until the moon rose and set again, leaving the world in absolute darkness. Then she rose, silently, wrapping herself in the threadbare shawl that was her only protection against the cold, and slipped out of the cabin into the night. Snow had begun to fall, thick flakes that muffled sound and turned the familiar landscape into something strange and dreamlike. Dinah moved through the darkness like a ghost, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the paths where someone might see her footprints in the morning. She made her way to the big house, to the kitchen door that she knew would be unlocked because Hattie always forgot to secure it properly. The kitchen was dark except for the faint glow of banked coals in the cook fire. Dinah moved to the window, the same window where she had stood so many times before, looking out at a world she was not allowed to claim as her own. She reached into the secret pocket in her dress and pulled out the supplies she had gathered, the knife and matches, the food and the map. She tucked them into a small cloth bag she had hidden behind the flour barrel. A bag she had sewn weeks ago from scraps of fabric no one would miss. For a moment she stood there, her hand pressed against the cold glass of the window, and allowed herself to remember. She thought of her mother, sold away when Dinah was just 10 years old, gone south to Louisiana and never heard from again. She thought of her brothers, younger than her, their faces already fading in her memory no matter how hard she tried to hold on to them. She thought of the life she might have had if she had been born free, the choices she might have made, the person she might have become. Then she pushed the window open, letting in a rush of freezing air that made the coals in the cook fire flare briefly bright. She climbed through the opening, her skirts catching on the frame, her hands numb with cold as she lowered herself to the ground outside. Behind her, the window remained open, frost already beginning to form on the sill. And on the glass, pressed into the icy condensation, was the clear outline of her handprint, each finger distinct, the lines of her palm visible like a signature. Dinah did not look back. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and began to run, heading north across the cotton fields toward the line of trees that marked the edge of the Caldwell property. The snow fell harder now, erasing her footprints almost as soon as she made them. And the wind howled through the bare branches of the oaks like something alive and hungry. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like they would give out beneath her. Ran until the big house was just a distant shape behind her, barely visible through the swirling snow. Then she allowed herself to slow to a walk, breathing hard, her breath coming in white clouds that disappeared into the darkness. She pulled the map from her bag and tried to orient herself, looking for landmarks she had memorized, the distinctive shape of a lightning-struck tree, the bend in the creek that marked the northern boundary of the plantation. The cold was worse than she had anticipated. Despite her preparation, despite the extra petticoat she had put on under her dress, the winter air cut through her clothes like knives. Her hands and feet were already going numb, and she knew that if she did not find shelter soon, she would freeze to death long before the patrollers found her. But she also knew that she could not stop, could not rest. Not yet. She needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and Caldwell Plantation before dawn, when her absence would be discovered. She walked through the night, following the map she had memorized, keeping the North Star as her guide when the clouds broke enough to let her see the sky. She crossed the creek at a shallow place she had scouted weeks before during one of her rare trips to gather herbs for Hattie's kitchen, the icy water soaking her shoes and stockings, making her feet ache with cold. She climbed over fallen logs and pushed through thickets of brambles that tore at her dress and scratched her hands bloody. As the sky began to lighten with the false dawn that comes before true sunrise, Dinah found the first safe house marked on her map. It was a small cabin set back from the road, smoke rising from the chimney, chickens scratching in the yard despite the snow. She approached carefully, watching for any sign of danger, her hand on the knife in her bag. The code phrase she had been taught came to her lips, the words that would identify her as a runaway seeking help. She knocked on the door, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slow ones. The door opened a crack and a woman's face appeared, brown-skinned and lined with age, eyes sharp and assessing. Dinah spoke the code words, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded and pulled her inside, shutting the door quickly against the cold. The cabin was small but warm, a fire burning in the stone hearth, the smell of cornbread and beans making Dinah's stomach clench with sudden hunger. The woman, who introduced herself only as Rachel, gave Dinah a cup of hot tea and a bowl of stew, watching as she ate with the desperate speed of someone who did not know when she would eat again. Rachel did not ask questions, did not demand explanations. She simply told Dinah that she could rest here for a few hours, that when night fell again she would be taken to the next station, that she must trust the network of people who had dedicated their lives to helping others reach freedom. Dinah slept on a pallet near the fire, falling into an exhausted sleep the moment she closed her eyes. She dreamed of her mother's face, of hands braiding her hair with patient gentleness, of a voice singing old songs in the twilight. When she woke, it was afternoon, and Rachel was moving quietly around the cabin, preparing food, mending clothes, living a life that seemed impossibly normal and peaceful to Dinah's eyes. They did not speak much. Rachel seemed to understand that Dinah was not ready for conversation, that she needed silence to process what she had done, the enormity of the risk she had taken. As darkness fell, Rachel gave Dinah warmer clothes, a heavy wool coat that had belonged to her husband before he died, boots that were too large but could be stuffed with rags to make them fit. She packed food in a sack, cornbread and dried apples, a piece of smoked ham wrapped in cloth. When full night had fallen, a knock came at the door, 2 quick and 3 slow, the reverse of the code Dinah had used. Rachel opened the door to reveal a young man, white-skinned with serious eyes, who introduced himself as a friend and said he would take Dinah to the next stop on the road north. Rachel embraced Dinah briefly, the first kindness Dinah had received from another person in longer than she could remember, and whispered a blessing in her ear. Dinah followed the young man out into the night, climbing into the back of a wagon where she was hidden under false floorboards, a space barely large enough for her to lie flat, suffocating in its closeness. The wagon began to move, wheels creaking on the frozen road, and Dinah lay in the darkness listening to the sound of the horses' hooves, trying not to think about what would happen if they were stopped, if the patrollers discovered her hiding place. The journey north continued like this for weeks, a pattern of movement and hiding, of travel by night and rest by day, of kind strangers who risked everything to help her. She stayed in barns and cellars, in attics and root cellars, in places so cold she thought she might die from exposure, and places so hidden she could barely breathe. She walked when there was no other transport, following guides who knew every path and trail, who could read the stars and the moss on trees, who moved through the wilderness with the confidence of those who had made this journey many times before. She crossed rivers on rickety bridges that swayed in the wind. She hid in haystacks while patrollers searched the barn around her. She ran from dogs whose baying echoed through the forest like the hounds of hell. She went hungry for days at a time when food was scarce. She suffered from frostbite that turned her toes black and made every step agony. She fought off fever and exhaustion and despair that threatened to overwhelm her. One particularly harrowing night, about 2 weeks into her journey, Dinah found herself trapped in a barn while a group of slave catchers searched the property. She had been hiding in the loft, buried under loose hay, hardly daring to breathe as the men below prodded the stalls with long poles, their voices rough and eager with the prospect of the reward they would collect if they found her. The farmer who owned the barn, a secret sympathizer with the Underground Railroad, had come in and engaged the men in conversation, offering them whiskey and deliberately leading them away from the area where Dinah was hidden. She had lain there for 3 hours, her muscles cramping, her body shaking with cold and fear, listening to the men laugh and boast about the runaways they had caught, the violence they had inflicted, the money they had earned. When the slave catchers had finally left, the farmer had helped Dinah down from the loft, had given her warm food and a place to rest, had apologized for the terror she had endured. He was a Quaker, he explained, a member of a religious community that believed slavery was a sin against God, and he had been helping runaways for 10 years, despite the legal risks and the social ostracism it brought him. He told Dinah about the network of people like him, ordinary men and women who had decided that their conscience was more important than the law, who risked fines and imprisonment to help strangers reach freedom. His words had given Dinah strength, had reminded her that not all white people supported slavery, that there were those who believed in human dignity and were willing to act on that belief. The journey also brought unexpected moments of beauty that sustained Dinah through the hardest parts. One morning, after walking all night through a frozen forest, she had emerged onto a hilltop just as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed too beautiful for a world that contained so much cruelty. She had stood there for a few precious minutes, watching the light spread across the landscape, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and had felt a surge of hope so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She was still alive. She was still free. She was still moving toward a future that belonged to her and her alone. Another time, she had been hidden in a cellar for 3 days while a winter storm raged above, and the family who owned the house had sent their young daughter down to keep her company. The girl, no more than 8 years old, had brought Dinah food and water, had sat with her in the darkness and talked about her school lessons and her pet cat and her dreams of becoming a teacher. The innocence and kindness of this child, who saw nothing strange in treating an escaped slave as a person worthy of friendship, had touched something deep in Dinah's heart. It had reminded her that humanity was not a property of race or station, that kindness could come from unexpected places, that the next generation might build a better world than the one she had been born into. Dinah also met other runaways on the Underground Railroad, people whose stories of escape and survival mirrored her own in countless ways. There was William, a man in his 30s who had fled from a plantation in Alabama after his wife was sold away, who was traveling north in hopes of earning enough money to buy her freedom. There was Sarah and her 3 children, the youngest just a baby, who had escaped from Kentucky with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a determination to give their children a life in freedom. There was James, an old man who had been enslaved for 60 years and who had finally decided that he would rather die trying to be free than live one more day in bondage. These encounters, brief though they were, created a sense of community among the runaways, a shared understanding that needed no words. They would pass each other in the night, traveling in opposite directions on the Underground Railroad, and would exchange a nod, a whispered blessing, a moment of recognition that said, "I see you. I know what you are doing. I honor your courage." These connections, fleeting and fragile, reminded Dinah that she was part of something larger than herself, part of a great migration toward freedom that involved thousands of people, a collective act of resistance against a system that claimed ownership of human souls. The conductors on the Underground Railroad were equally diverse, coming from all walks of life and all backgrounds. There were free blacks who risked being kidnapped and sold into slavery themselves to help others escape. There were white abolitionists, Quakers and Methodists, and ordinary people who believed that slavery was wrong and were willing to act on that belief. There were former slaves who had bought their freedom or escaped years earlier, and who now dedicated their lives to helping others follow the same path. Each of them had their own reasons for participating in this dangerous work, but all of them shared a commitment to the cause of freedom that transcended personal safety or comfort. One conductor in particular made a lasting impression on Dinah, a woman named Harriet who met her at a safe house in Tennessee. Harriet was herself a former slave who had escaped from Maryland and who now returned to the South again and again to lead others to freedom. She was small in stature but fierce in spirit, carrying a pistol that she said she would use on herself before allowing herself to be captured again. Harriet spoke to Dinah about the importance of courage, about the need to keep moving forward even when every instinct screamed to hide or turn back, about the fact that freedom was worth any price, any sacrifice, any risk. Harriet told Dinah stories about the people she had helped escape, families reunited in freedom, children who would grow up knowing only liberty, old people who died free after a lifetime in bondage. She spoke about the biblical story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, and said that every person who escaped from slavery was making their own exodus, was claiming their birthright as children of God. Her words resonated with Dinah, who had been raised with the stories of the Bible, who had found strength in the tales of people who had resisted oppression and found deliverance. Harriet's faith and courage renewed Dinah's own determination, reminded her why she had chosen this path and why she had to see it through to the end. But she also experienced moments of unexpected grace. A family who shared their meager supper with her and asked for nothing in return. A child who smiled at her from a doorway, too young to understand the danger but old enough to sense the importance of what was happening. A conductor on the Underground Railroad who told her stories of others who had made it north, who had found freedom and built new lives, who had never given up hope even in the darkest moments. Meanwhile, back at Caldwell Plantation, the discovery of Dinah's escape had caused an uproar that shook the entire county. Marcus Caldwell had come down to breakfast to find his eggs cold and his coffee unserved, had stormed into the kitchen to find it empty except for old Hattie, who had dragged herself from her sickbed to try to manage the morning meal. The open window, still standing wide despite the freezing temperature, had been the first clue that something was wrong. The handprint on the glass, already remarked upon by the housemaid who had come to light the fires, had been the second. Marcus had immediately sent for the overseer and the slave patrollers, had offered a reward of $500 for Dinah's capture, so dead or alive. The patrollers had combed the surrounding area, had questioned every slave on the plantation and on the neighboring farms, had followed every possible trail. But the snow had covered Dinah's tracks, and by the time they realized she must have headed north, she was already 2 days ahead of them, already hidden in the network of safe houses that stretched toward the free states. The handprint on the window became the subject of intense speculation. Some said it was a curse Dinah had laid upon the house before she left. Others claimed it was a message, a sign of defiance, a promise that she would never be caught. The housemaid tried to clean it away but found that no amount of scrubbing would remove it. The glass seemed to have been etched by the cold, the print preserved as permanently as if it had been carved there. Marcus Caldwell ordered the window replaced entirely, but the new glass also bore the handprint, appearing overnight as if by magic, as clear and distinct as the original. Evangeline Caldwell became convinced that the house was haunted, that Dinah's spirit was still present, watching them, judging them. She took to her room and refused to come out, dosing herself with laudanum until she barely knew where she was. The children whispered about the ghost in the kitchen, daring each other to go look at the handprint, running away screaming when the wind rattled the window frame. The other enslaved people on the plantation spoke of Dinah in hushed tones, wondering if she had made it to freedom or if her body lay frozen in some distant forest. They took courage from her act of defiance, from the fact that she had dared to run even when success seemed impossible. Her escape became a story they told each other in the darkness of the quarters, a reminder that resistance was possible, that the chains that bound them were not unbreakable, that freedom, however distant, however dangerous to seek, was still worth fighting for. Dinah herself was unaware of the legend that was growing around her disappearance. She was focused only on survival, on moving forward, on reaching the border between slavery and freedom. She traveled through Tennessee and into Kentucky, each mile bringing her closer to the Ohio River and the free state of Ohio beyond it. The journey that should have taken weeks stretched into months as she was forced to hide from increased patrols, as winter storms made travel impossible, as her guides were arrested or fled or simply vanished into the complex web of the Underground Railroad. She reached the Ohio River on a night in late February, standing on the Kentucky shore and looking across the dark water to the lights of the free state beyond. The river was partially frozen, great chunks of ice floating in the current, deadly to anyone who tried to cross in the darkness. But Dinah had come too far to turn back now, had risked too much to hesitate at this final barrier. Her guide, an older man who had made this crossing 100 times, led her to a small boat hidden in the reeds. They pushed off into the current, the boat rocking dangerously as they navigated between the ice floes, the oars making soft splashing sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Dinah sat in the bottom of the boat and prayed to the God her mother had taught her about, prayed to the ancestors who had survived the Middle Passage, prayed to whatever force in the universe might listen to the prayers of a runaway slave seeking freedom. They made it across just as dawn was breaking, pulling the boat up onto the Ohio shore, and Dinah stepped out onto free soil for the first time in her life. She stood there for a moment, breathing the cold morning air, feeling the ground solid beneath her feet, and allowed herself to cry. Great racking sobs that shook her whole body, releasing 11 years of fear and pain and suppressed rage. The guide led her to another safe house, this one run by a Quaker family who welcomed her with quiet efficiency, gave her dry clothes and hot food, let her sleep in a real bed for the first time since she had left Caldwell Plantation. When she woke, the mother of the family sat with her and explained what would happen next. How she would be taken to Cincinnati, where there was a community of freed blacks who would help her find work and housing. How she would need to be careful because slave catchers still operated even in the free states. How she would have to build a new life from nothing but her own courage and determination. Dinah stayed with the Quaker family for a week, recovering her strength, learning to navigate this new world where she was not property, where her time was her own, where she could walk down the street without papers or permission. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, this freedom she had dreamed of for so long. She found herself unsure how to act, how to speak, how to simply exist as a person rather than as someone's possession. When she was well enough to travel, the Quakers arranged for her to go to Cincinnati with a group of other freed people who were heading to the city for work. The journey took 2 days by wagon, and Dinah spent the time looking out at the landscape of Ohio, at the farms and towns, at the people going about their business, at a world that was both familiar and utterly foreign to her. Cincinnati in 1838 was a bustling river city, growing rapidly with the influx of immigrants and freed blacks seeking opportunity in the West. The black community there was well established, with its own churches and schools and businesses, and Dinah was taken in by a family who ran a laundry service and needed experienced workers. She was given a room in the attic, small but clean and private, the first space that had ever been truly hers. The transition to freedom was more difficult than Dinah had imagined it would be during all those years of dreaming about escape. She had expected freedom to feel like joy, like relief, like a burden lifted from her shoulders, and while it did feel like all those things, it also felt like terror and confusion and a profound sense of disorientation. For the first time in her life, she had to make her own decisions, had to navigate a world where she was responsible for herself, had to learn how to be a person rather than property. The simplest choices, what to eat, when to sleep, how to spend her free time, felt overwhelming at first because she had never been allowed to make such choices before. She found work washing and mending clothes, labor that was hard but no harder than what she had done at Caldwell Plantation, and crucially, labor for which she was paid. The first time she held money she had earned herself, coins that belonged to her and her alone, she felt a rush of emotion so powerful she had to sit down. This was what freedom meant, she realized. Not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, the ability to make decisions about her own life, to keep the fruits of her own labor, to be a person rather than property. But freedom also meant navigating a complex and often hostile world. Cincinnati sat on the border between slave and free states, and slave catchers operated openly in the city, kidnapping free blacks and escaped slaves alike to sell them back into bondage. Dinah had to learn to carry her free papers with her at all times, had to learn which parts of the city were safe and which were dangerous, had to learn to be constantly vigilant because the price of carelessness could be a return to slavery, or even death. She heard stories of free blacks who had been kidnapped off the streets in broad daylight, of families torn apart when slave catchers produced false documents claiming ownership, of the corruption in the legal system that made it nearly impossible for a black person to get justice. She also had to learn to deal with the prejudice and discrimination that existed even in the free states. Many white people in Cincinnati viewed free blacks with suspicion and hostility, seeing them as competitors for jobs, as threats to public order, as inferiors who should know their place. Dinah experienced this prejudice in countless small ways. Being denied service at shops, being forced to sit in segregated sections of churches and theaters, being paid less than white workers for the same labor, being subjected to insults and threats simply for existing in spaces that white people believed belonged to them alone. Yet despite these challenges, Dinah also found community and support in the black neighborhoods of Cincinnati. She attended church services where hundreds of free blacks gathered to worship and to support each other, where the preachers spoke about liberation and justice, where the congregation sang spirituals that had sustained enslaved people through generations of bondage. She joined mutual aid societies where black women pooled their resources to help each other in times of need, providing loans for those who wanted to start businesses, caring for the sick and elderly, supporting widows and orphans. She made friends with other women who had escaped from slavery, who understood without explanation the complicated emotions that came with freedom, the guilt of leaving loved ones behind, the fear of being recaptured, the joy of finally being able to live as a full human being. She enrolled in reading and writing classes at the church, improving the skills her mother had given her, learning to do arithmetic and geography and history. She discovered a love of learning that had been suppressed during her years in bondage, devoured books borrowed from the church library, stayed up late reading by candlelight even though she had to rise early for work. She learned about the abolitionist movement, or about people like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth who were using their voices to fight against slavery, about the political battles being waged over the expansion of slavery into new territories, about the growing tensions between North and South that some predicted would lead to war. She also learned practical skills that helped her navigate her new life. She learned to manage money, to save for the future, to make a budget that would allow her to support herself without falling into debt. She learned to sew well enough to take on extra work as a seamstress, making and mending clothes for the wealthier families in Cincinnati. She learned to cook dishes beyond the plantation food she had prepared at Caldwell Plantation, experimenting with recipes and ingredients that had been forbidden to her before. Each new skill represented another step towards self-sufficiency, another way of claiming her freedom and building a life that belonged to her. The community she found in Cincinnati also introduced her to the concept of political activism and collective resistance. She attended lectures by abolitionists who spoke about the moral evil of slavery and the duty of all people to work for its abolition. She participated in fundraising efforts to support the Underground Railroad and to purchase the freedom of enslaved people. She joined protest marches against the Fugitive Slave Act, which required free states to return escaped slaves to their owners and which had resulted in numerous kidnappings and wrongful imprisonments of free blacks. Through this activism, Dinah came to understand that her personal escape from slavery was part of a larger struggle for justice and human rights. She saw that freedom was not just about individual liberation, but about collective transformation, about building a society where all people were treated with dignity and respect regardless of their race or background. She learned that she had a voice and a story that mattered, that her experiences and her survival had value, that she could contribute to the fight for justice by speaking her truth and supporting others who were fighting the same battle. It was through this community of activists and former slaves that Dinah met Joseph, the man who would become her husband. Joseph had been born free in Pennsylvania, the son of parents who had purchased their own freedom through years of hard labor, and he worked as a carpenter in Cincinnati, building houses and furniture, taking pride in work that was his own. He was 10 years older than Dinah, a quiet man with steady hands and a kind heart, and he had been drawn to her strength and resilience, her determination to build a new life despite the trauma she had endured. Their courtship was slow and careful, both of them scarred by lives that had taught them to be cautious with their hearts. Joseph had lost his first wife to cholera, had buried her and their infant son in the same week, and had sworn he would never marry again. But Dinah's courage and her refusal to be defined by her past had broken through his grief, had reminded him that life was for the living, that love was still possible even after loss. For her part, Dinah had never expected to find love, had thought that freedom would be enough. But Joseph's patience and kindness had shown her that she deserved not just liberty but also happiness, not just survival but also joy. They were married in a small ceremony at the church, surrounded by friends from the black community, by fellow activists and former slaves, by people who understood what their union represented. It was not just the joining of two people, but a statement of defiance against a system that had tried to reduce them to property, that had denied their humanity, that had sought to prevent them from forming the bonds of family and love that are the birthright of all people. Their marriage was an act of resistance, a declaration that they would not just survive but thrive, that they would build lives of dignity and meaning despite everything that had been done to them. She enrolled in reading and writing classes at the church, improving the skills her mother had given her, learning to do arithmetic and geography and history. She made friends with other women who had escaped slavery, who shared their stories of loss and survival, who understood without explanation the complicated mix of grief and joy that came with freedom. She learned to navigate the city, to avoid the areas where slave catchers were known to lurk, to carry the papers that proved her free status, to be always vigilant because the reach of slavery was long and the price on her head had never been withdrawn. Years passed. Dinah married a man named Joseph who had bought his freedom through years of saving every penny he earned as a carpenter. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and Dinah raised them in freedom, teaching them to read and write, telling them stories of where they had come from, making sure they understood the price that had been paid for the life they now lived. She never told them about the handprint on the window, about that last moment in the Caldwell kitchen when she had pressed her hand to the glass before climbing through to freedom. That was a memory she kept to herself, a talisman against forgetting, a reminder of the moment when she had chosen to risk everything rather than accept bondage for one more day. She followed the news from the South, reading the newspapers that reported on the growing tensions between slave states and free states, on the political battles over the expansion of slavery into new territories, on the increasing numbers of enslaved people who were running north seeking freedom. She contributed what money she could to the Underground Railroad, opening her home to runaways who needed a place to hide, passing on the help she had received to others who were making the same desperate journey. In 1861, when the war between the states finally began, Dinah was 40 years old, a respected member of the Cincinnati community, a mother and wife, a survivor. She watched as the young men of the city, black and white alike, enlisted to fight, as the country tore itself apart over the question that had defined her entire life. She volunteered at the hospital where wounded soldiers were brought, washing bandages and writing letters for men who could not hold a pen, offering what comfort she could to boys who were dying far from home. The war years tested Dinah in ways that were different from but no less challenging than her escape from slavery. The hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, men missing limbs, suffering from infections, dying slowly and painfully from wounds that no doctor could heal. Dinah worked 12-hour shifts, washing blood from bandages that would be used again because supplies were scarce, holding the hands of young men as they died, writing final letters to mothers and wives who would receive them weeks after their loved ones had been buried in unmarked graves. She saw the waste and horror of war up close, saw boys barely old enough to shave torn apart by bullets and artillery, saw the field hospitals that ran out of chloroform and had to perform amputations on fully conscious patients who screamed and thrashed while being held down by their comrades. She saw the racial segregation that persisted even in the face of shared suffering. Black soldiers relegated to inferior medical care, treated as less deserving of attention than their white counterparts, dying in greater numbers from preventable infections and neglect. But she also saw moments of heroism and humanity that reminded her why the war was being fought, why the question of slavery had finally erupted into open conflict. She saw black soldiers who had enlisted to fight for their own freedom and the freedom of their people. Men who showed courage under fire despite being denied the same pay and recognition as white soldiers. She saw white soldiers from abolitionist backgrounds who treated black soldiers as equals, who spoke out against the discrimination they witnessed, who risked censure from their own officers to demand better treatment for all. One soldier in particular stayed in Dinah's memory, a young black man named David who had been born into slavery in South Carolina and had escaped to join the Union Army. He had been shot in the leg during a battle in Virginia, and the wound had become infected, necessitating amputation. Dinah had sat with him before the surgery, had held his hand as he wept, not from fear of the pain to come, but from frustration that his fighting days were over before he had done enough to free his people. He had told her about his mother and sister still enslaved on the plantation where he was born, had made Dinah promise that if he died, she would try to find them after the war and tell them that he had fought for their freedom. David survived the surgery but died 3 days later from infection, and Dinah kept her promise. After the war ended, she traveled to South Carolina and found David's family, told them about his courage, gave them the few possessions he had left behind, a Bible and a photograph and a letter he had written before the battle that killed him. His mother had wept and thanked Dinah for bringing her son's memory home, and Dinah had realized that this was part of her purpose, to bear witness to the lives and deaths of those who had fought for freedom, to make sure their stories were not forgotten, to honor their sacrifice by remembering and telling what they had endured. During the war, Dinah also became more active in the abolitionist movement, attending rallies and lectures, contributing what money she could to organizations working to support the war effort and prepare for the challenges that would come after slavery was abolished. She heard Frederick Douglass speak in Cincinnati, his powerful voice calling for black men to be allowed to fight for the Union, arguing that the war was not just about preserving the nation but about ending the evil of slavery forever. His words resonated with Dinah, who had lived through slavery and who understood that half measures and compromises would never be enough, that only complete abolition could begin to heal the wounds that slavery had inflicted on the nation. She also met Sojourner Truth during this period, the famous preacher and activist who had been born into slavery in New York and who had become one of the most powerful voices in the abolitionist movement. Sojourner came to Cincinnati to raise money for freed slaves who were fleeing to the North, and Dinah attended her speech, was moved to tears by the older woman's eloquence and passion, her refusal to let anyone diminish her humanity or silence her voice. After the speech, Dinah approached Sojourner and told her briefly about her own escape from slavery, and Sojourner had embraced her and said that every person who escaped was a victory against the slaveholders, a proof that the human spirit could not be permanently enslaved. These encounters with famous abolitionists inspired Dinah to begin speaking publicly about her own experiences, to add her voice to the chorus of former slaves who were telling their stories to convince the public that slavery was evil and must be destroyed. She spoke at churches and meeting halls, telling audiences about her years at Caldwell Plantation, about her escape on that snowy winter night, about the Underground Railroad and the people who had risked everything to help her reach freedom. She spoke about the handprint on the window that would not melt, using it as a metaphor for the permanence of human dignity, the impossibility of completely erasing the evidence of resistance and courage. Her speeches were powerful because they were personal and specific, because she did not speak in abstractions about the evils of slavery, but told concrete stories about real people, about mothers separated from children, about men whipped for trying to learn to read, about the daily degradations and cruelties that were the foundation of the slave system. Audiences would sit in stunned silence as she spoke, many hearing for the first time from an actual escaped slave about what slavery truly meant, and her words helped to sway public opinion in the North toward supporting complete abolition, rather than compromise measures that would have allowed slavery to continue in some form. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, Dinah joined the celebrations in the streets, singing and crying and dancing with thousands of others who understood what this moment meant. Slavery was not yet fully abolished. The proclamation only applied to the Confederate States, but it was a beginning, a promise, a recognition that the institution that had destroyed so many lives was finally, slowly, dying. The day the news reached Cincinnati, the entire black community poured into the streets in spontaneous celebration. People who had been enslaved, people who had been born free, people who had bought their freedom or escaped to claim it, all came together in a moment of shared joy and relief that transcended individual circumstances. Dinah stood in the crowd with Joseph and their children, holding her youngest daughter in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she sang old spirituals that had sustained enslaved people through generations of suffering. The songs that had once been sung in secret coded messages about freedom and resistance could now be sung openly, declarations of triumph over a system that had claimed ownership of human souls. But even in that moment of celebration, Dinah understood that the proclamation was only the beginning, that true freedom would require more than a document signed by a president, more than a declaration that slavery was illegal. The structures of oppression ran deep, were woven into the economic and social fabric of the nation, and dismantling them would require generations of struggle and sacrifice. She thought of the millions of people still enslaved in the South, thought of how difficult their transition to freedom would be, thought of the resistance they would face from former slaveholders who would use every means at their disposal to maintain their power and privilege. In the years following the war, Dinah witnessed both the promise and the failure of Reconstruction, the brief period when it seemed possible that the United States might truly become a multiracial democracy where all people had equal rights and opportunities. Black men gained the right to vote. Black representatives were elected to state legislatures and to Congress. Schools were established to educate the formerly enslaved, and for a few years it seemed as though the country might actually live up to the ideals of freedom and equality it had claimed to represent. Dinah participated actively in this political transformation, attending meetings of the local Republican Party, encouraging black men to register to vote, speaking at rallies about the importance of political participation and education. She saw black men casting ballots for the first time, exercising a right that had been denied to them for generations, and she felt both pride and frustration that this right extended only to men, that women, regardless of their race, were still excluded from the political process. She had escaped slavery, had risked death for freedom, had built a life through her own courage and determination, and yet she could not vote, could not have a direct say in the laws that governed her life. She also worked to support the newly freed slaves who were flooding into Cincinnati and other northern cities, people who arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hope that freedom would mean opportunity. Dinah helped establish schools and churches in the black community, worked with organizations that provided food and shelter and job training to the refugees from slavery, used her own experiences to counsel people on how to navigate the complex and often hostile world of freedom. She knew from personal experience how difficult the transition could be, how overwhelming it felt to suddenly be responsible for yourself after a lifetime of being treated as property. And she wanted to ease that transition for others as much as she could. Her own children grew up in this period of transition and possibility. She had 3 children with Joseph, 2 daughters named Grace and Ruth after women who had helped her on the Underground Railroad, and a son named Benjamin after the stable worker who had first told her about the North Star. She raised them with stories about where they came from, about the price that had been paid for their freedom, and about the responsibility they had to honor that sacrifice by living lives of dignity and purpose. She taught them to read and write, sent them to the schools that had been established for black children, encouraged them to pursue education and to believe that they could be whatever they chose to be. Grace, her oldest, showed an early aptitude for learning and became a teacher. Working in the schools that educated freed slaves in the South during Reconstruction. Ruth became a seamstress who eventually opened her own shop, employing other black women and building a successful business that provided financial security for her family. Benjamin followed his father into carpentry, learning the trade and eventually becoming a contractor who built homes for the growing black middle class in Cincinnati. Dinah watched her children thrive and felt a satisfaction that went beyond personal pride, felt that she was witnessing the redemption of all the suffering she had endured. Proof that freedom could lead to flourishing, that the children of slaves could build lives of accomplishment and dignity. But Dinah also witnessed the rollback of Reconstruction, the abandonment of freed slaves by the federal government, the rise of terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan that used violence and intimidation to deny black people their rights. She read newspaper accounts of massacres and lynchings, of black voters being driven from polling places, of elected black officials being murdered or forced to flee, of schools and churches being burned to the ground. She saw the Compromise of 1877 and federal protection for black citizens in the South, saw the imposition of Jim Crow laws that created a system of segregation and discrimination that would last for another century. The betrayal of Reconstruction was a bitter pill for Dinah, who had believed that the Civil War had finally settled the question of slavery and racial equality, who had thought that the country had learned the lessons written in blood across the battlefields of Virginia and Tennessee and Georgia. She realized that the fight for true freedom and equality would continue long after her death, that the work she had begun by escaping from Caldwell Plantation was part of a struggle that would span generations, that her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would still be fighting for rights that should have been guaranteed by the Constitution. Yet she did not despair, did not allow the setbacks and disappointments to destroy her hope or her commitment to justice. She continued to work for change in whatever ways she could, continued to speak and teach and organize, continued to tell her story to anyone who would listen. She understood that social change was slow and nonlinear, that progress often came in fits and starts, that the arc of history might bend toward justice, but only because people like her bent it through their courage and their refusal to accept injustice as permanent or inevitable. During these years, Dinah also maintained connections with the Underground Railroad network that had saved her life. many of whom continued their activism in new forms after the war. She corresponded with former conductors, shared news about people who had been helped to freedom, attended reunions where escaped slaves and their helpers could gather and remember the dangerous work they had done together. These connections were precious to her, reminders of a time when ordinary people had risked everything for the sake of strangers, when the bonds of human compassion had proven stronger than the laws and customs that supported slavery. After the war ended, Dinah made a decision she had been contemplating for years. She decided to go back to Mississippi to see what had become of Caldwell Plantation, to stand once more in the place where she had been enslaved. Her husband tried to talk her out of it, worried about her safety, but Dinah insisted. She needed to go back, needed to see it with free eyes, needed to close that chapter of her life properly. She traveled south by train, a journey that would have been impossible in her youth, sitting in the colored car, but sitting nonetheless, a passenger rather than cargo. The landscape of Mississippi had changed. The war had torn through the delta, plantations burned, fields gone to seed. The old order destroyed even as the prejudices that had supported it remained stubbornly alive. She hired a wagon in Jackson and drove out to what had been Caldwell Plantation, following roads she remembered from the map she had drawn so long ago. The big house was still standing but showing signs of neglect, paint peeling, shutters hanging crooked, weeds growing in what had once been manicured gardens. Marcus Caldwell had died during the war. She learned from inquiries in town, and Evangeline had sold off most of the land, living in reduced circumstances in the house with just 2 servants to care for her. The slave quarters were abandoned, the cabins falling into ruin, the fields being worked by sharecroppers who were technically free but still bound to the land by debt and poverty. Dinah walked up to the big house and knocked on the front door, something she never could have done in her youth. A young black woman answered, a servant but not enslaved, and Dinah asked to see Evangeline Caldwell. She was led into the parlor, dusty and faded but still grand, and there she waited until Evangeline appeared. The years had not been kind to Evangeline. She was an old woman now, thin and worn, her hair white, her hands shaking with palsy. She did not recognize Dinah at first, could not connect this confident, well-dressed woman with the slave girl who had worked in her kitchen so long ago. When Dinah spoke her name, Evangeline's face went pale and she sank into a chair as if her legs would not hold her. They talked for an hour, a strange and painful conversation that circled around all the things that could not be said, all the harm that could not be undone, all the years that stood between them like a wall. Dinah asked about Hattie and learned that the old cook had died during the war, asked about the other people she had known and learned that most had scattered after the plantation failed, seeking work in the cities or going north or simply disappearing into the chaos of the Reconstruction South. Evangeline asked about Dinah's life, her escape, her years in Ohio, and Dinah told her some of it, though not all, not the worst parts, not the fear and hunger and cold that had nearly killed her. Finally, Dinah asked to see the kitchen, and Evangeline, too tired to refuse, led her through the house. The kitchen was smaller than Dinah remembered, shabbier, the cook fire cold, dust coating the surfaces. But the window was still there, the same window Dinah had climbed through on that snowy night so long ago. And on the glass, faint but still visible after all these years, was the handprint, Dinah's handprint, preserved in the glass like a fossil in stone. Dinah walked to the window and placed her hand over the print, matching her living hand to the ghost of the hand she had pressed there in 1837. They fit perfectly, the lines and whorls identical. A connection across time between the enslaved girl she had been and the free woman she had become. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of all those years, all that loss, all that struggle, all that survival. Then she turned to Evangeline and said the words she had come all this way to say, Words of forgiveness, perhaps, or maybe just of ending, of closing the circle that had begun in this room so long ago. She told Evangeline that she had made a good life, that she had raised children in freedom, that she had survived and thrived despite everything that had been done to her, that the handprint on the window was not a curse but a promise, a message to all those who came after that freedom was possible, that resistance was possible, that no system of oppression could completely destroy the human spirit. Evangeline wept, though whether from guilt or relief or simple old age, Dinah could not say. She did not care. This moment was not about Evangeline or her feelings, was not about granting absolution to those who had done wrong. This moment was about Dinah reclaiming her own history, about standing in the place where she had been powerless and claiming her power, about looking at the evidence of her courage and honoring it, about bearing witness to her own survival. She left the big house and walked through the abandoned quarters, standing in the doorway of the cabin where she had slept those 11 years, seeing it now for what it had been. A prison, no matter how the apologists for slavery had tried to dress it up as something gentler. She walked through the cotton fields, now overgrown with weeds and brambles, and thought of all the people who had labored here, all the lives that had been consumed by this land, all the grief that had soaked into this soil along with the blood and sweat and tears of the enslaved. As the sun set, Dinah stood at the edge of the plantation, looking north toward the road she had taken all those years ago, toward the life she had built, toward the future she had claimed for herself and her children. She did not regret coming back, but she also knew she would never return here again. This place belonged to the past, and she belonged to the future, however uncertain and difficult that future might be. She went back to Cincinnati and to her family, back to the life she had built through determination and courage and the help of strangers who had believed that freedom was worth fighting for. She lived to see the 13th Amendment abolish slavery throughout the United States, lived to see her children grow and have children of their own, lived to be an old woman surrounded by grandchildren who knew slavery only as a story, a terrible history that belonged to another time. But she never forgot the handprint on the window, never forgot the moment when she had chosen freedom over safety, risk over acceptance, the unknown over the familiar horror of bondage. And in her final years, when her grandchildren asked her to tell them the story of how she had escaped, she would describe that snowy night, the open window, the frozen handprint that would not melt, and the long journey north to freedom. The handprint itself remained on the window at Caldwell Plantation long after Dinah's death, long after Evangeline died and the house was sold to new owners, long after the last traces of the plantation system had faded into memory. People who came to the house remarked on it, tried to clean it away or replace the glass, but the handprint always returned, a mystery that defied explanation, a ghost that refused to be forgotten. Some said it was a miracle, a sign from God condemning slavery and honoring those who had resisted it. Others claimed it was simply a trick of the glass, a flaw in the manufacturing that happened to resemble a handprint. But those who knew the story, who understood what it represented, saw it as something more important than either miracle or coincidence. They saw it as a testament, as evidence that could not be erased or denied, as a reminder that every enslaved person who had ever lived had been a complete human being with hopes and dreams and the capacity for courage, that their resistance and survival and escape had written themselves into the very fabric of the land, that their stories deserved to be remembered and honored and told. The story of Dinah Bell and the handprint that would not melt spread through the years, passed down through generations, changed and embellished and sometimes distorted but never completely forgotten. It became part of the larger narrative of American slavery and resistance. One story among thousands, one life among millions, one act of courage among countless others that had together dismantled the institution that had seemed so permanent, and unshakable. And perhaps that is the real meaning of the handprint, not that it was magic or supernatural, but that it represented something that could not be erased, the human desire for freedom, the refusal to accept bondage as natural or inevitable, the willingness to risk everything for the chance to live as a free person rather than as someone else's property. Dinah Bell pressed her hand to that window on a winter night in 1837, and in that gesture she claimed herself. She declared her humanity. She refused the role that had been assigned to her by a society built on the lie that some people were meant to be slaves and others meant to be masters. The handprint remained because the truth it represented remained, because the question of freedom and human dignity that Dinah had answered with her escape was still being asked and answered by every generation that came after her. It remained because forgetting was impossible, because the past could not be erased no matter how much some people might wish it, because the cost of freedom had been too high, and the people who had paid that cost deserved to be remembered. Dinah Bell died in 1896 at the age of 75, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, a woman who had lived long enough to see the world she had been born into utterly transformed. Her obituary in the Cincinnati newspaper was brief, noting that she had been born into slavery and had escaped to freedom, that she had been a pillar of the community, a devoted wife and mother, a woman of courage and conviction. It did not mention the handprint on the window, did not tell the full story of her escape, did not capture the enormity of what she had achieved simply by refusing to accept the life that had been forced upon her. But her family remembered. Her children told their children, who told their children, and the story lived on, changing as all stories do, but retaining at its core the essential truth of what had happened on that winter night when Dinah Bell had chosen freedom, when she had pressed her hand to a cold window and then climbed through to a new life, when she had left behind a mark that would not fade, a testament that would not be silenced, a story that would not be forgotten. The handprint on the window at what had been Caldwell Plantation remained visible well into the 20th century, long after the house had been converted into a museum dedicated to the history of the plantation system and the enslaved people who had lived and worked there. Visitors would stand in front of the window and listen to the story of Dinah Bell, would place their own hands over the faint outline of hers, would try to imagine what it had taken for one woman to make the choice she had made, to take the risk she had taken, to claim for herself the freedom that should have been her birthright. In the end, the story of Dinah Bell is not just about one woman's escape from slavery. It is about the thousands of people who made similar journeys, who risked everything for freedom, who survived or did not survive, but who all refused to accept bondage as their fate. It is about the Underground Railroad and the people who operated it, black and white, enslaved and free, who created a network of resistance that helped thousands reach freedom despite the laws and the violence arrayed against them. It is about the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, about the human capacity to endure suffering and still choose hope, about the power of one person's decision to change not just their own life, but to inspire others to make the same choice. Dinah Bell left more than a handprint on a window. She left a legacy of courage, a reminder that freedom is never given but must always be claimed, that justice is not automatic but must be fought for, that the arc of history bends toward freedom only because people like her bent it, people who refused to accept oppression, who risked everything to claim their humanity, who survived and told their stories so that future generations would know the truth of what had been done and what had been overcome. The handprint on the window stands as a symbol of all this, a simple mark left by a woman who had been told she was property, who had been denied every basic human right, who had been treated as less than human by a society that built its wealth on the backs of enslaved people. But in that moment when she pressed her hand to the glass before climbing through to freedom, Dinah Bell declared that she was human, that she had worth and dignity, that she deserved to be free, and that declaration, made in silence and in secret on a winter night in 1837, echoes down through the years to the present day, a reminder of the price of freedom and the courage of those who claimed it. Her story, like the handprint itself, refuses to be erased, refuses to be forgotten, refuses to melt away with the changing seasons or the passage of time. It remains as a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the power of resistance, to the possibility of transformation, to the truth that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched or how brutal, can completely destroy the human longing for freedom and the willingness to risk everything to achieve it. Dinah Bell's handprint on the window is a promise to all who see it that freedom is possible, that courage is rewarded, that survival itself is an act of resistance, and that the stories of those who fought for their freedom deserve to be remembered and honored for all time.